while fireworks exploded across the sky and millions counted down to a new beginning. Elvis Presley sat awake in silence. No party, no champagne, no celebration, just a clock moving closer to midnight, and a year he wasn't sure he wanted to carry with him. Stay until the end, because this story reveals a New Year's Eve that forced Elvis to confront something far more unsettling than the passing of time, the realization that not every new year brings renewal. The house was quiet, too quiet for a night that was supposed to be loud. Elvis sat alone in a dimly lit room, one lamp casting a soft glow against the walls. Outside, distant sounds of celebration drifted in through the windows. Laughter, car horns, music bleeding faintly from somewhere down the street. None of it belonged to him. He glanced at the clock. 11:41 p.m. 19 minutes left. Elvis didn't reach for a drink. He didn't turn on the television to watch crowds gather or numbers flash across the screen. He had done that before, years ago, when time still felt like something he could outrun. Tonight, he wanted to feel it. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to listen. His body felt heavy in a way rest didn't fix. Not exhaustion, accumulation. The kind that settles after years of movement without pause. New Year's Eve had always carried expectation. Hope packaged neatly into a single night. The promise that something would reset simply because the calendar said it should. Elvis had stopped believing in that a long time ago. He thought about the year he was leaving behind, not in highlights or headlines, but in moments. Long nights, repetitive mornings, conversations that never fully resolved, applause that arrived on time and left nothing behind. The clock ticked forward. 11:45. Elvis stood and walked slowly toward the window, parting the curtain just enough to look outside. A few lights flickered in the distance. Somewhere, someone was already counting down early, impatient for the year to be over. He wondered when time had started feeling less like opportunity and more like pressure. There had been years when New Year's felt electric, when the future stretched wide and undefined, when he believed effort alone could shape whatever came next. Now, the future felt narrower, not hopeless, defined. Elvis rested his forehead lightly against the cool glass. His reflection stared back faintly, layered over the night outside. He didn't study it. He simply acknowledged it. A man who had lived many versions of himself and wasn't sure which one he was carrying forward. 11:52. The silence in the room thickened, interrupted only by the clock's steady movement. Each second felt intentional now, like it was asking something of him. Elvis realized then that he wasn't afraid of the new year. He was afraid of repetition, of waking up to the same patterns, the same compromises, the same quiet sense that time was moving faster than meaning. He returned to the chair and sat down again, hands resting loosely on his knees. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to imagine not what the new year might bring, but what he might leave behind. The thought was uncomfortable. Letting go always was. 11:58. Outside, the noise grew louder. People gathering, voices rising. The collective anticipation of a moment everyone agreed mattered. Elvis stayed seated. He didn't need a countdown to know something was ending. As the clock approached midnight, Elvis felt a strange calm settle over him. Not relief, not excitement, clarity. The realization that a new year didn't require celebration to begin. It required honesty. And as the final minute slipped away, Elvis understood something quietly powerful. If the next year was going to be different, it wouldn't be because time had changed. It would be because he did. The first explosion echoed through the night like a distant thunderclap. Elvis flinched slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. Midnight had arrived, not with ceremony, but with force. Outside, the sky lit up in brief, violent bursts of color, each one met with cheers and whistles from people he couldn't see. He didn't move toward the window. Instead, he stayed seated, hands still resting on his knees, listening as the world celebrated without him. The sounds overlapped now. Fireworks, laughter, music, horns blaring in uneven rhythms. It all blended into a single roar of expectation, as if joy itself had been scheduled. Elvis felt strangely detached from it. Not bitter, not resentful, just distant. He thought about how many New Year's Eves he had spent surrounded by people yet felt alone anyway. Parties filled with noise where conversations never landed anywhere real. Champagne poured, glasses raised, resolutions declared with confidence no one expected to keep. Those nights had taught him something important. Celebration didn't guarantee connection. The fireworks continued, each one briefly illuminating the room through the thin gap in the curtains. Colors flickered across the walls, red, gold, white, gone almost as soon as they appeared. Temporary. Elvis closed his eyes. The past year replayed itself not as events, but as sensations, the weight of expectation, the pressure of continuity, the quiet moments where he realized he was moving forward without fully choosing direction. He hadn't collapsed. He hadn't failed. He had drifted. That realization hurt more than any obvious mistake could have. Outside, the cheers rose again as another wave of fireworks erupted. Elvis imagined people hugging, kissing, shouting promises into the air, believing that the turn of the clock had given him permission to start over. He understood the desire, but he also understood its limitation. Change didn't arrive on schedule. It arrived when you stopped avoiding the truth. Elvis stood slowly, moving toward the table where a small notebook lay untouched. He had brought it out earlier, without knowing why. Now he understood. He opened it. The blank page didn't intimidate him. It invited him. Elvis didn't write resolutions. He didn't list goals or plans. He wrote a single sentence, carefully, deliberately. I don't want to carry everything forward. He read it once, then again. The sentence felt heavier than the entire celebration outside. He wasn't sure yet what everything meant, only that some things had to stay behind. Patterns, expectations, versions of himself that no longer fit. The fireworks reached their peak now, the sky exploding in rapid succession, the noise almost overwhelming. Elvis closed the notebook and placed it back on the table. He didn't need to watch the sky to know what was happening. He needed to listen inward. For the first time in years, the beginning of something didn't feel like pressure. It felt like permission. Permission to slow down. Permission to choose differently. Permission to let a year end without pretending it had been perfect. As the noise outside began to fade, Elvis realized that while the world celebrated the arrival of the new year, he had quietly done something far more difficult. He had admitted that something needed a change. And that admission, he knew, was more powerful than any countdown. Elvis didn't rush. That was the first difference he noticed. After midnight had passed and the noise outside began to thin, he stood by the door for a long moment, coat in hand, listening to the house settle back into itself. The celebration was already dissolving into fragments. Distant laughter, car doors slamming, the last few fireworks echoing like afterthoughts. The year had turned. Nothing dramatic had followed. Elvis stepped outside and closed the door behind him. The sound firm but gentle. The night air was cool, clean, carrying the faint smell of smoke from fireworks burned out too quickly to matter. The street looked almost peaceful now, littered with remnants of celebration that already felt abandoned. He walked without destination. No driver, no schedule, no one waiting. Each step felt intentional, as if he were testing the ground beneath him, making sure it would hold without applause or permission. His hands rested in his pockets. Shoulders relaxed for the first time in hours. This was the first hour of the new year, and it belonged to no one but him. Elvis passed houses where lights were still on, shadows moving behind curtains. Somewhere inside, people were telling the same stories they told every year, about fresh starts, about promises made too easily in the warmth of company. He didn't judge them. He had believed in those stories once. But walking alone now, Elvis understood something that felt both sobering and relieving. Beginnings weren't loud. They weren't announced. They didn't arrive wrapped in noise. They arrived quietly, often after disappointment, after honesty, after the courage to admit that celebration alone wasn't enough. He stopped at the corner and looked down the empty road ahead. The asphalt reflected the streetlights in thin, wavering lines. It reminded him of the way time felt now, stretching forward without demanding urgency. Elvis thought about the man he had been on previous New Year's Eves, the version of himself who believed effort could solve everything. who assumed that endurance was the same as purpose. That man had carried him far, but not far enough. The quiet allowed memories to surface without resistance. Moments he had brushed past, decisions he had postponed, conversations he had avoided because they threatened momentum. None of them felt accusatory. They felt instructive. Elvis realized then that this walk wasn't about leaving the old year behind. It was about acknowledging it without embellishment, seeing it clearly without fireworks or false optimism. That clarity felt grounding. He turned back eventually, not because he was finished thinking, but because he didn't need to go farther to prove anything. The house waited, unchanged, familiar. As he reached the door again, Elvis paused, one hand on the handle. The new year didn't feel lighter, but it felt honest. And honesty, he knew, was something he could build on slowly, deliberately, without spectacle. He stepped inside and closed the door, carrying the quiet with him. The celebration was over. The work, he sensed, had just begun. Morning arrived without ceremony. No sense of renewal. No dramatic shift. Just light creeping through the curtains and a quiet reminder that time moved forward whether anything had changed or not. Elvis woke later than usual, not because he'd slept deeply, but because he hadn't rushed himself into the day. He lay still for a moment, listening to house, the soft hum of its familiar sounds, the absence of urgency. New Year's morning had always carried a strange expectation, as if waking up alone somehow meant you'd done something wrong the night before, as if joy had rules you were expected to follow. Elvis felt none of that. What he felt instead was continuity. The thought surprised him. He sat up slowly and let his feet touch the floor, grounding himself in the simple reality of being awake. His body felt the same as it had the night before, no lighter, no heavier, but his awareness had shifted. In the kitchen, the clock read just past 8. Outside, the street was quiet again, the remnants of celebration already being cleared away. Time had done what it always did, moved on, indifferent to promises and intentions. Elvis poured coffee and sat at the table, hands wrapped around the mug, letting the warmth settle into his palms. He thought about the sentence he'd written the night before. I don't want to carry everything forward. It hadn't faded overnight. If anything, it felt clearer. Elvis understood then that the night hadn't been a release. It had been a decision, and decisions, unlike emotions, didn't disappear when a feeling passed. That realization carried weight. It meant he couldn't rely on the new year to do the work for him. He couldn't expect clarity to arrive fully formed just because the calendar said it should. The responsibility remained his. He looked around the room, noticing how much of his life was structured around continuity. Objects placed where they'd always been. Routines preserved because they worked, not because they still fit. He wondered how many of those structures he had outgrown without acknowledging it. The thought wasn't overwhelming. It was practical. Elvis finished his coffee and stood, feeling a steady resolve settle in. Not motivation, not inspiration. Commitment, the kind that didn't announce itself. He knew there would be moments in the coming days when a decision felt inconvenient, when momentum would try to pull him back into familiar patterns, when silence would tempt him to ignore what he'd admitted to himself. But the morning had confirmed something important. The truth he'd faced the night before hadn't belonged to the night. It belonged to him. And as the day unfolded quietly around him, Elvis accepted that this year wouldn't be defined by fireworks or declarations. It would be defined by what he chose not to carry anymore. The morning didn't reset anything. It reinforced it. And that, he realized, was exactly what he needed. As the day unfolded, Elvis became aware of how often habit tried to reclaim him. Small things first. The urge to fill silence with noise. The impulse to make calls simply because time allowed for them. The reflex to say yes before considering whether he actually meant it. Each one surfaced quietly, familiar and convincing, and each one asked the same question. Are you going to do this the way you always have? Elvis didn't answer immediately. He let the question linger. He spent the afternoon moving slowly through the house, not searching for anything in particular, but noticing what he usually moved past without thought. Old photographs on shelves. Items collected during years when memory mattered more than rest. Evidence of a life lived at full speed. Some of it still felt like him. Some of it didn't. Elvis realized that carrying everything forward wasn't just exhausting. It was unnecessary. Not every role, not every expectation, not every version of himself deserved to survive unchanged. That thought felt dangerous, liberating. He sat down and wrote again, not a list of resolutions, but a quiet inventory. What drained him, what felt automatic but hollow, what he continued out of obligation rather than intention. The answers weren't dramatic. They were honest. And honesty, he was learning, didn't need spectacle to be powerful. As evening approached, Elvis noticed something else, a subtle resistance within himself. Letting go sounded simple in theory, but it required confronting the fear of disappointing people who had grown comfortable with a version of him that never paused. He understood that fear well. He had built a life around meeting expectations. But that life had come at a cost. This year, he decided, wouldn't be about becoming someone new. It would be about becoming selective. Selective with energy. Selective with time. Selective with what he allowed to shape his days. That decision didn't erase uncertainty. It reframed it. Elvis stood by the window again as night settled in. The street quiet, ordinary, unremarkable. There were no fireworks now. No countdowns. Just time moving forward at its natural pace. And for the first time in a long while, that pace felt manageable. He understood then that the new year wasn't offering him a blank slate. It was offering him discernment, the ability to choose what mattered enough to continue, and what needed to be left behind, without apology. That choice would need to be made again and again, but it had already begun. Weeks later, Elvis would struggle to explain why that New Year's Eve stayed with him. Nothing dramatic had happened. No witnesses. No turning point anyone else could point to. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. He carried the year forward differently. Not louder. Not bolder. Quieter. He noticed how much space that quiet created. Space to think, to feel, to respond instead of react. He became more deliberate in his movements, more attentive to what cost him energy and what returned it. The world didn't change its demands, but Elvis changed how he met them. There were days when old habits tugged hard, days when momentum tried to override intention, days when it felt easier to carry everything again rather than decide what to set down. On those days, he remembered the silence of that night, the absence of spectacle, the honesty without witnesses, the clarity that didn't depend on celebration. That memory grounded him. Elvis understood now that beginnings didn't need applause. They didn't need agreement or acknowledgement. They needed commitment, the quiet kind that survives when no one is watching. That new year hadn't promised him renewal. It had offered him responsibility, and he had accepted it. Not perfectly, not all at once, but deliberately. As the months passed, Elvis found himself less afraid of time, less pressured by its movement. He no longer expected a calendar to fix what only attention could. The year began without fireworks, without cheers, without anyone knowing. And that, he realized, was why it mattered, because the changes at last rarely announce themselves. They begin in silence, and they continue, because someone finally decided not to carry everything forward.